Next, I want to invite up Comrade Satya. She is a nursing student and an activist organizer with the PSL here in Albuquerque. So please welcome her to the stage.
So another 4 years and another election. 2020 elections are almost here, and climate change, nothing less than an existential issue in our lifetime, is a flashpoint in the 2020 Democratic Party debates. For the past 4 years, the Democratic Party elites kept busy trashing Trump, the individual who is supposed to be the devil, while having little to say about the capitalist system that produced him. And a majority of their time and attention was spent on the Trump-Russia hoax, which essentially collapsed with the findings of the Mueller investigation. This is how the capitalist politicians kept themselves relevant for the past 4 years, while mass poverty, child hunger, racist deportations, homelessness, tuition hikes, unaffordable health care, environmental degradation, endless wars remain much of the same or have worsened. Now it's election time once again. The Democratic Party politicians' focus on climate change this election season is a result of the pressure they feel from the grassroots movement and its base, regular working class people who are extremely concerned about the potential of living in a world unrecognizable to them in the coming decades. CNN was planning to even host a climate crisis town hall for next month in which 10 Democrat presidential candidates would have debated. But just 2 days ago, the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, rejected the proposal for a single issue debate. This general shift in the politicians' focus on climate change, however, is because they feel that they can no longer ignore us working class people in this country who not only want to see a serious discussion, but want immediate radical action on climate change. Climate change, which is really only one aspect of the ecological devastation under capitalism, as we made it very clear here today. The politicians understand that there would be a political cost to pay if they don't at least pay lip service to this issue. But third party and independent candidates are excluded from the election debates. These debates are watched by tens of millions of people across the country. Nearly half of the voters in the 2016 elections registered as independent rather than pledged themselves to either of the two ruling parties. The Commission on Presidential Debates, the organization that hosts the election debates, is a private corporation made up of billion-dollar companies like Anheuser-Busch and Philip Morris. It was created in 1988 as a pact between the Democratic and Republican parties to stage manage the debates, pre-select the debate moderators and topics. The fact that only the Republican and Democratic Party candidates are given access to the presidential debates is a flagrant violation and mockery of the concept of democracy. The debates are in many ways a farce and a sham, as is capitalist democracy, a system of guaranteed rule of the rich with the appearance of choice. Two parties that serve the billionaire capitalist class and work to preserve the status quo. And every 4 to 8 years, the two parties take turns, they switch out. In previous years, when the Party for Socialism and Liberation, the PSL, has run presidential candidates to use a national platform to promote a socialist program, we were never given the opportunity to be on national television to debate, challenge, and expose the representatives of the two corporate parties and their progressive posturing. Any alternative perspective that fundamentally questions and threatens the two-party system is denied voice in this country. Socialists like us are excluded deliberately in a calculated way so that the two parties can carry on business as usual. In this election cycle, clearly, Joe Biden is the preferred candidate of dominant sections of the ruling class. which is Wall Street banks, military contractors, private prisons, telecommunication tycoons, oil and gas industry, the imperialist foreign policy establishment, and much of the Fortune 500 companies. But we are not buying what politicians like Joe Biden are selling. If the PSL were to be on that debate stage for the 2020 election cycle, debating one of the leading Democratic Party candidates like Joe Biden, what would we have to say? What would aspects of a socialist program to address climate change look like? So let's break down Democrat candidate Joe Biden's so-called plan for a clean energy revolution and environmental justice. First, Joe Biden promises to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, which sets an objective to keep temperature rise below 1.5 degrees, which we would say is the easiest and laziest thing that he could possibly do, and I'll explain why. When the Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement in 2017 to restore the coal industry, which something even the coal industry doesn't really think is possible, and when Trump abandons the climate agreement to roll back all environmental regulations, a ton of large energy companies and other major corporations asked Trump to stay in the agreement. Why? Because energy and extraction corporations feel a fire under their behinds from global lawsuits and organized resistance by impacted communities and concerned people demanding accountability for climate change and the destruction of their ecosystems. US corporations would rather the US stay in the Paris Climate Agreement because it is good PR for them. James Hansen, the world's most prominent climate scientist, called the Paris Climate Agreement a fraud. It is not a science-based deal. In his own words, he said, quote, "It's just worthless words. There is no action, just promises." And we agree. It's an unenforceable agreement, an agreement that this or that capitalist politician in the US can abandon at any point with no consequences. As long as fossil fuels appear to be the most profitable option, corporations will continue to burn them. In reality, to keep temperatures below a 2-degree rise, we will have to keep 80% of all fossil fuels in the ground where they belong. We socialists would see to it that an emissions reduction agreement between nations is based in scientific findings, binding, enforceable, accountable to the people of the world, prioritized and carried out rapidly. That fossil fuel use be essentially banned and the energy sector be nationalized, brought into public ownership. That such an agreement between the nations of the world must be based on cooperation, not competition, and willful exchange of the necessary resources and technology between the richer and the poorer countries to whom a debt is owed, with the industrially developed imperialist nations, the so-called first world countries that are responsible for the majority of the greenhouse emissions over the past 2 centuries, carrying the bulk of the responsibility in reversing this trend. Next, Biden's campaign promises to invest a measly $1.7 trillion for the next 30 years in research and development and zero carbon technologies. So that by 2050, we would have 100% clean energy and net zero emissions. This is outrageous. Scientists say we have about 12 years to fix climate change before it's a point of no return. And politicians like Biden feel no real urgency, even though the technology to transition exists and a national emergency could be declared today if the US political establishment were to choose to. But they won't do it because their real concern is for the profits that the fossil fuel industry capitalists would lose out on if a radical transition occurs.
Right.
Second, the question we all have to ask is why only $1.7 trillion will be allocated over 30 years to transition when the US government has no trouble allocating over $1 trillion, that's a trillion with a T, dollars every single year to US military operations and a massive expansion of the US nuclear arsenal for endless racist wars. As As the largest consumer of fossil fuels in the world, the Pentagon is also one of the largest contributors to climate change globally. Yet the Department of Defense has a blanket exemption from all greenhouse gas treaties. And nowhere in Joe Biden's program to address climate change or in the new Green Deal being proposed by the more progressive Democrat candidates is the murderous and polluting role of US militarism given any real attention, let alone barely mentioned. It is not just the Republicans who allow the military to pollute at will. When Obama issued an executive order requiring the US government to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the Pentagon was exempted from even having to report its emissions. It's not just the Pentagon. CEOs of companies like ExxonMobil, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman are laughing all the way to the bank. With no restriction on the way the Pentagon operates, corporations that make up the military-industrial complex and service the US military are bringing in enormous profits. An example of this two-faced game that the US politicians are playing is when in 2016, the Obama administration pledged to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, while at the same time ordering the Pentagon to plan for national security issues arising from climate change. Meaning, as the world spirals into chaos with mass displacement due to sea level rise, extreme weather, and drought-driven starvation, the Pentagon will protect the imperialist ruling class. The wealthy imperialist countries with the resources to do so will build virtual fortresses around their countries, preserving resources for themselves, while the countries they have looted from for centuries struggle to access food, clean water, or energy. Already under both major ruling parties, millions of people are deported and millions more continue to be imprisoned then sent back for seeking political or economic asylum. Hundreds of millions of people are projected to be displaced globally due to environmental and climate catastrophe. We need not imagine what the imperialist US government will do to these people when they show up at its doorstep asking for refuge. To this, we would say, building walls and more bombs is the antithesis of a solution at a time when cooperation and pooling of resources across borders is the only salvation for humanity and all living things. And for the PSL, stopping US wars and standing in solidarity with the people of the world fighting US imperialism is non-negotiable. We would shut down the largest polluting institution in the world, the Pentagon, the US military, and establish some form of a working class civilian militia to be trained to defend. No more war, no more deportations, no more occupations or walls, sanctions, and regime changes. All the resources currently channeled into the US death machine must be redirected toward life. This will have immediate environmental benefits. It will decrease global tensions. Peace is our only chance for a future in which people throughout the world approach common problems cooperatively. Now let's get back to Biden's revolutionary plan to fight climate change. In his campaign video, Biden says things like, the US is only responsible for 15% of global emissions. Global action requires American leadership. We will make every nation go beyond their initial commitment, especially true for China, by far the world's largest emitter of carbon, he said. These statements are not only arrogant in nature, they're also half-truths and factually inaccurate. It is true that the US today emits about 15% of the global carbon dioxide emissions just from fossil fuels, and China emits about 20%. But the US is also responsible for almost 1/3, so about 33% of the total excess carbon dioxide that is in the atmosphere, while China is actually responsible for less than 1/6 of the total. So how can this be? Between 1850 and 1960, the industrializing capitalist economies of the European countries that colonized most of the world and the United States dominated emissions. From 1960 to 2005, the United States was the biggest CO2 emitter in the world. It wasn't until 2005 that China surpassed the United States as the biggest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions. But the way US politicians talk about China, you think that China is responsible for ruining the earth single-handedly and that the US imperialists have no part in it. The population of the US is just over 4% of the world's population. China, on the other hand, has a population of 1.4 billion people. China, once a colonized, underdeveloped country, has had to develop its industry and infrastructure rapidly to attempt to meet the needs of over 1 billion people. And still, the Chinese actually burn less than half as much fossil fuel on average, so per capita, than Americans do. With just over 4% of the world's population, the United States uses one-fourth of the world's fossil fuel resources, completely unsustainable and destructive to the planet. China, on the other hand, is on track to meeting its climate change goals 9 years earlier than planned under the Paris Agreement. China is made out to be considered the boogeyman of global climate diplomacy by the United States government. But China is becoming the largest investor in solar and wind technology and provides more jobs in solar energy than in coal mining. China has invested in clean energy on an unprecedented scale and has installed more renewable capacity than any other country in the world. Today, it is responsible for 1/3 of all wind turbines and solar panels in the world. It now has almost half the world's electric vehicles and charging infrastructure and 99% of the world's electric buses. Contrary to Joe Biden's posturing about the US having to, quote, hold Chinese leaders accountable for reducing carbon, it is China that is leading while the US is sitting on the sidelines waiting for other countries to do the work that it has the responsibility to do. The imperialist countries that contributed the most to climate change historically are doing the least, but what they are experts at doing is scapegoating and trashing China every chance they get. We know that this anti-China and anti-Russia demonization campaigns underway are ultimately about US imperialism gearing up for a major confrontation against China and Russia, both countries whom the US sees as economic and political barriers to its own unrestricted domination and plunder of the world. And we are being prepared, we the people in the US are being prepared and conditioned to prevent a homegrown opposition to a major devastating US war in the future. But Biden doesn't stop there on China. He goes on to say that China should be stopped from, quote, financing dirty fossil fuel projects all across Asia. Like all US imperialists, what Biden means is that the US government must put a stop to China's economic development, as well as China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is allowing for infrastructural development in 152 countries in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America that have been kept in a state of perpetual underdevelopment through centuries of colonialism and economic subjugation using imperialist financial institutions. This is what the imperialist US politicians are against, the rest of the world developing. For all the decades that the US was the primary trading partner of African countries, the continent for the most part remained impoverished. US imperialism would rather that the people of the global south be kept in a state of economic dependency. It's also important that I mention that since the 50s, majority of the US manufacturing has been shipped off to these same developing countries by multinational corporations to derive super profits from super exploitation of third world labor, what the capitalists call as cheap labor. So capitalism is a system based in competition and a never-ending drive for profits using unrestricted growth and overproduction. But we reject such a world system. We stand for socialism, a system based in cooperation and mutual aid between nations to sustainably meet the needs of all people, which is really only possible if the economy is planned by the working class for the working class, so we can prevent wasteful overproduction and establish a pathway to a zero-waste society. So if we had a revolution in this country, if the US had a socialist government in power, so much would be possible. A massive redirection and reorientation of resources and scientific study to addressing and reversing the ecological catastrophe plaguing the global working class. Workers and the millions of unemployed people would be trained and transitioned into environmentally sustainable jobs using the instrument of a planned economy. And remember, unemployment is a permanent feature of capitalism. The basic needs of all people would be met in a sustainable way by bringing into public ownership the means of production and distribution, which will guarantee the right of all people to housing, education, healthcare, and food. Unrestricted growth of urban population centers, which is completely unsustainable, would be addressed. There would be no place for environmental racism under a socialist government that would recognize and respect self-determination for historically oppressed nations of people inside and outside the US. We would export green technology, not bombs. We would export trained scientists and technicians and share our resources, expertise, and scientific knowledge with the world and vice versa. The countries around the world that continue to divert their limited resources to defend themselves from US military invasions would no longer have to do so. We would lift unjust criminal economic sanctions on countries like Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, DPRK, North Korea. So sisters and brothers, this is not the time to be pessimistic. This is not the time to give up on ourselves and give into the future that the capitalist class has paved way for us. The mainstream solutions to climate change don't talk about the reorganization of society or the need for a new system. They want to fight climate change without wrecking the profit margins for the mass polluters, the capitalists, the corporations. We are at a time for incremental change. We need radical change. But a revolution is what it will take. And revolution means an overthrow of one mode of production with another, one type of political economic system with another, which is what we propose, a real revolution. Revolution in the United States is not only possible, but it is imperative. As the US moves toward major confrontation with China and Russia, nuclear catastrophe is what awaits us all. Don't wait on politicians. Only working class struggle has the power to stop the course we have been put on. We must build a mass movement from thousands to millions of people. Get organized into a revolutionary organization today. Join the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Fight back. Thank you.
Great. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, Satya. And yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. We're getting organized to fight back.